Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 649. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. Experimentation. Experimentation's a dirty word in many organizations. However, it can be a powerful tool to drive and guide change. Tammy Gretz shares how she adopted experiments in her practice and how she uses them to change the behavior and culture of people and organizations. I am occasionally asked why I enjoy meetups so much. Meeting people like Tammy is a major part of the reason. Thanks to the women in Agile Cleveland for the great introduction, which led to this interview. Tammy's bio. Tammy is an Agile coach making shift happen. Tammy says, I generously collaborate, embrace tension, and use it to make shift happen. I've been influencing change through servant leadership, elbow grease, and lattes for over 20 years. I'm a massive maker, and the majority of my education comes from experimentation and the relentless pursuit of understanding team dynamics, embracing tension, and using it to fuel innovation and change in the workplace and beyond. Contact information for Tammy is in the show notes. Are you ready to experiment with change? It's time for the interview. Tammy Gretz, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
This is very exciting. I heard you give a presentation to Women in Agile up in Cleveland. Well, up in Cleveland. You were not up in Cleveland. Everybody was Zooming. We're still all Zooming or something like Zoom. So, but it was really spectacular. I was really impressed and wanted to bring this to my audience across the globe.
Well, I'm excited about that because I want to bring it to everyone. The experiments to everyone. So yeah, this is exciting.
So that's the cool part, right? This is all about experimentation. And I've had this discussion a couple of times. The word experiment, I mean, it might as well be, in some organizations, might as well be a 4-letter word, and one of those bad 4-letter words. But why don't you share your story about adopting experimentation to drive change? So, which really was the core of what I heard, and then we can dive into some of the really cool aspects of that.
Yeah. So, I had your typical experience of I'm learning about Agile and wanting to do this thing. And, there's all the certifications out there. And I went and got my first certification, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this thing. I have all the knowledge now, so let's go do it. And I showed up to my first day, and I was completely flabbergasted that I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never done it before. I'd never run a daily scrum before, never done sprint planning before. And that, that point in my life was really disheartening, I guess is the word. Because I was really excited about this idea of Agile and a different way of working. And it was a couple years later that I struggled through it, and I tried to do some experiments, but not in the way that I'm thinking about it today. What an experiment is, I would try things, and then I would try something else, but I wasn't documenting anything, and I really wasn't learning from what I was experiencing. I was just trying a bunch of stuff. They say throwing the spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, and not really understanding what we were learning or even what we were trying to get from the experiment that we were doing. I was very young, Agilist at the time. And I had this experience in 2018 where I was invited to an experiment basically with IDEO. And I got to go and do this project where they wanted to create a circular future around the waste that Nike, the shoe company, essentially, they wanted to create a product out of their waste. And so they asked the public, they partnered with IDEO, they asked the public to come in and help solve that problem. And I went into it not knowing what I was getting into, but I learned so much in a 3-month period, and it was all experiments. It was, I don't know how to do this. Let's try this thing. Let's get feedback and then try something else. And it was very rapid, and I didn't have any time to wallow in any kind of, oh, I didn't do that right, or why isn't this working? You just had to keep going to get to that deadline. And out of that experiment, we made the short list on this experiment of, there were 430 applicants of ideas on how to use Nike's waste, basically, of the tennis shoe manufacturing. And we made the top 30. And I was
Wow.
completely flabbergasted by that. And it started a whole nother cycle of, okay, now what do we do? And how do we actually take this idea that's in our head and actually make a real prototype that you can hold in your hand and show to somebody and sell it? That was my first idea of what a real experiment is like or should be like.
So how did that change your life?
Well, prior to that, I was only gathering knowledge. I kept feeling like I didn't know enough. And so I would go get another certification, or I would go to another course, or I would go to another talk, and maybe I would get just that perfect nugget and everything would slide into place and I would know how to run an Agile team perfectly. And that wasn't happening. And I struggled the first 5 years of being an Agilist, and I had that moment and I came out of that experiment. We made the top 30, but we didn't win, which I'm probably very thankful at this point, because I don't know that I wanted to run a business around Nike shoe rubber. But I left that experiment and I was like, this is what I wanted to do. And I had started to make parallels on what we were doing to what happens on an Agile team. Like you try something, you learn from it, you try something else and you learn from it. And eventually you get to that end increment, right? The final product that you're trying to get to. And even though we didn't win, I got to the end because I was doing that project. I was working 40 hours a week as a Scrum Master, probably more than that. But then I would come home and I would work on this project for another 5 or 6 hours almost every night. And I loved it. I would sign me up, let's do this again. And I was like, how do I make this my job? And I thought about it and I'm like, well, it's empiricism, really. You're learning and observing from what is, and you're doing these small little things. And I started to apply that to a lot of different things. As a Scrum Master, I was like, what experiment can I try and get feedback on the daily Scrum? How can I improve what sprint planning looks like? Just a little bit. And I said in my talk, I talk about the 1% improvement idea, that you can improve anything by 1%. And if you improve all sections of a system by 1%, you're that much better. And if you don't improve or you go backwards, you're worse off than if you were just to improve by 1%. Kind of botched that up a little bit, but it's the idea of just that continuous improvement in the smallest increment. And I did that with the daily Scrum. That was my first experiment with my teams.
Did you call it an experiment?
Sprint planning. I didn't call it an experiment. No. This was all I kept all this inside. I was like, oh, we're not going to talk about this out loud. Because like you said, it's a 4-letter word and teams get nervous. They're like, well, what if we fail? And how do we talk about, failing at the management level? And so a lot of this stuff I was doing, and it was like my own personal lab. Like as a Scrum Master, I'm going to try this thing and I call it put vegetables in the smoothie for the team. Like we're doing this, but I'm trying something different, but I'm not actually telling them that I'm doing it. And it wasn't in a way that's invasive or telling the team what to do. It was just shifting. It was approaching it just slightly different. And from that experiment, a little bit more, I would try just something different. And then the team started to notice that there were shifts happening. They're like, what are you doing? What's happening here? And so I started to let them in on a couple of things. And just simple experiment as the team that I was working with had never really talked about the Scrum values. And I put them up on the wall one day. And they said, we're going to talk about one of the Scrum values. And you guys get to pick somebody who is emulating the Scrum value just as a game today. Because we used to do a game or a question of the day. And so for a month, we focused on like Scrum values. And it was just supposed to be a fun little thing that we were doing on the side. I was educating them, but they were learning from it. And a really interesting thing happened is as they started to play this game with me, which was an experiment in my head, was a game to them. It didn't mean anything. They started to build relationships with each other because they started to learn about each other by playing this little game. And so I was like, oh, I'm facilitating relationships here. And I noticed that because these two people now understand this segment of something, they had some piece of work that they would start to talk to each other in a different way. And it wasn't weird for them to ask questions about work, even though one was a contractor and one was a full-time person, full-time employee. They were building these connections through playing this game. And I started to recognize, hey, that's something, and I started to document what I was seeing out of that. And that's just one of the ideas. And then at the same time, my company started talking about this idea of how do we help uplift our Scrum Masters at our company? Because I'm a consultant, so I go out and I work with clients, and then we have our consultancy, and we have programs and uplift at our consultancy to make sure that when we bring in somebody that they're getting uplifted and they get the opportunities. So at the client, we had this one thing going on where I was trying these things in secret, not in secret, but, invisible in experiments, whatever. And then at my consultant company, we were doing them out loud. We actually called them experiments. And we said, we're going to do a hypothesis, and then we're going to share what we learned. And the idea was that we did it with each other. We're going to try doing experiment on liberating structures. And we're going to practice doing liberating structures and how that changes how you deliver a daily scrum or a backlog refinement session. And so we were doing these experiments with each other. And then all of a sudden I was like, I'm going to do it at the client. I'm not going to tell them it's an experiment. I'm just going to say, we're going to go do this thing. And the first thing I had them do was, all right, there's a whole team. It's a safe program, and there were 10 teams in the program, and I asked some of the Scrum Masters if they were interested in going on a little quest. And because what I was struggling with this group of Scrum Masters is they were fairly new. They had either been voluntold or they raised their hand in the last year or so to be a Scrum Master. And, as a consultant, I was in there to help them uplift these Scrum Masters. And what I realized is they didn't know what they didn't know. And so to ask them to improve their daily Scrum, they didn't really know what a good daily Scrum looked like. I could tell them, but they needed to experience it for themselves. And I started to play with this idea and remember where I was when I started. And I was like, all right. So I got 5 of them together and I said, self-organize, because that was the word at the time. I said, self-organize, and I want you guys to go visit 5 other teams' daily Scrum. And I want to tell me what you learn when you go. You need to do it in 30 days using the Scrum framework. Go see what you find out. Come back and we'll talk about it. So we had a kickoff meeting. What's the purpose of the daily Scrum? What are your inputs and outputs of a daily Scrum? What makes a good daily Scrum? What are you looking for? What kinds of things? Just to kind of get them in that mindset. And then I sent them off and I did a midpoint check-in to make sure that they were still doing the experiment. Just, are you still doing this? Because we're going to talk about it at the end. And at the end, when we had the final debrief of the experiment, one of the things that came out of it, I don't remember all the things that came out of it, but one of the Scrum Masters said, the thing that was most useful about this quest, this going out and looking and observing other teams, was that I thought my way was the best way and the only way to run a daily Scrum. And I had no idea that there were other ways and other best ways to do it. And I really liked what I saw. There were some things that I have questions about, but what it made them do is go back and inspect their own practice. And that to me was gold. And then I was sold from that point on. I was like, this is all I want to do when I'm with Scrum Masters is run these experiments with them so that they can see what they haven't been able to see before, or they can know what they didn't know.
Have they always worked?
No. No, they haven't. Not all of them work. Some of them fail, but I always learn from them. So it depends on how you look at whether it worked or not, did I learn from it? what was useful about that, the assumption that I had that they would learn something from it is usually the example I give is that if it doesn't work, what did I learn from that? And was it my assumption in setting up my hypothesis that if they go and do this, they will learn from it? And I would say that one of the other experiments that we did, it worked, but it didn't stick. So they got interested. We did a metrics quest where we focused on flow metrics. And of course, we talked about velocity, we talked about throughput, and we talked about cycle time. Those are the three metrics that we focused on. And we had everybody involved in this. And we had managers, we had project managers, people who just didn't understand these metrics and why we use them. Why do we use velocity? Why do we use, these different metrics? And it was a great experience for knowledge gathering. And we had them go out and do observations. The thing was they had to go visit another team's board, and see what they could see based on what was on the team. Now, some of that, it's team level stuff and it's not necessarily for people outside the team, but the idea was for them to pair, to get them to practice pairing, what it's like as a Scrum Master to pair. Usually you talk about developers pairing, but you don't talk about Scrum Masters pairing. And so we paired Scrum Masters, we paired product owners with Scrum Masters and managers. And we said, take a look at your own metrics. What do you see? What questions do you have? And we had them bring those questions back, and then we had discussions about it. And we did have some good things come out of that, because when leadership would come around and want to know what certain metrics were, they had better answers for directing them when a leader only had the question of, well, how much have you increased your velocity? That great question. Right? But it's still out there. And so we had that conversation of what does the leader really want when they ask that question? What problem are they trying to solve? And how might you talk about it with that leader in a way that's respectful, so that you're not saying that's none of your business, it's a team metric, go away. Like, what's a better conversation you might have with that leader? And that actually happened because, big crazy story, but they had this thing where they wanted to know how many points something was. The leadership was asking, and the team came back because of this metric. And some of the managers were like, that's not really how we should be measuring that. We should be measuring that based on this. And it was a great conversation. That experiment, they turned that into an experiment for the leaders so that they could understand better what they were looking for to answer that question. So it was a failure, but it really wasn't a failure because something good came out of it.
I was about to say, what was the failure part of that?
Not all the teams that we worked with. Part of the experiment was go and add these metrics to your daily, conversations. Use them for sprint planning. Put them on your board. They use Azure DevOps or Jira. Put these metrics up on your board so your team can see them. And they were all gung-ho about it, and they went out and did it. And then we would go out, a month later or 2 months later, and it was never updated. So it didn't stick with everybody. So There's that.
So what a failure to me would be, because that doesn't sound, again, I understand the not stick, and I understand that it didn't roll through. A failure would be you go out to send Scrum Masters out to look at daily scrums, or whatever the word or phrase that you want to use for your daily meeting is. And they come back and say, God, we found this great mechanism where the leader stands up and tells everybody what their status is. And we only share status, and they tell them what their status is, and then we all go away. And we love that. That's the right answer. That would be a failure to my mind. It's like, oh my, when you set up an experiment, what would be sort of a good framework for people to think about experimentation so that we don't end up creating, psychos?
Yeah. So I've thought a lot about that, because that is a very real thing that I am afraid of, that they will go and see a bad example and feel that it's, oh, well, that's perfect. That's exactly what we need to do, because that was such an efficiently run daily scrum. They had swim lanes and everybody had their name, and it was like this. And I totally understand what you're saying there. So when a Scrum Master comes to me now, if they want to run an experiment, I also, whenever I'm thinking about running an experiment, especially if it's around Agile, I focus on which of the principles, the Agile principles, that experiment might support.
Mm.
And so in your example where the leader was telling them what to do.
Oh no, the leader was telling them what their status was. It was
what their
even
status was.
crazier. I mean, with the tasking stuff happened as part of that. But I still am not convinced I understand how that leader, because it wasn't even a Scrum Master, it was a team leader, knew what the status was for everyone and why they had to tell that person what his or her status was.
Yeah.
That to me, and I've been at this a while, I have never seen that before in my life. I was dumbfounded. I asked the person if they had mastered the Vulcan mind melt.
I love that. Oh, but yeah, I asked them, like, if anybody has come to me with certain things, because I do have a lot of project managers who want to be Scrum Masters, and they tend to fall back into some of those aspects. And so when I coach them, I talk about the Agile principles, and how is that supporting the Agile mindset, the 4 values or the 12 principles? And I let them tell me. And they usually come to their own conclusions. And there's some people that you can't, change their mind on it. They're going to do certain things. I can tell them, or I can sell them on what they might be doing, and I can ask questions. But the way I typically battle that is I have them look at the principles, and I say, how does this support that principle or any of these principles? Or which one is it violating if you continue down that path? Which one do you think this is going to bring down the value of that principle?
So when you use the term experimentation, you mentioned documentation, you mentioned the word hypothesis, none of which are bad words, by the way. I'm a big fan of the scientific method. What's sort of your approach? Do you document a hypothesis? Do you have an expected result? What's the logistics of this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. At my consultancy company, we do write the hypothesis out. We do write, and when I see X, I will know why. It indicates why, because the whole idea is not necessarily that it validates, but that you're learning from it, or that there's a correlation there somehow. And the idea is that we're doing that to learn, not to validate. And so we do write out the experiment. We do write a hypothesis. We put a time box on it, and we do a show and tell.
Oh, cool.
At the end of the time box, we do a show and tell. It's a hour-long meeting once a month that anybody who did an experiment, you get 10 minutes to come in and tell us what you did, what you learned, what you're going to do next. But before I had that very formatted way of doing it, I use the IDEO language from that Nike experiment and how might we? The how might we question, everybody's heard it. It's IDEO's, formula for, how do we make change happen? And so I started to use that as, how might I make my daily Scrum better? How might I make sprint planning better? And what does better mean? I don't know. I don't know where you are today. So it depends, if you look at the Agile principles and say, how might my daily Scrum adhere to the Agile principles of, I can't think of one right now because I'm talking to you, but thinking about the Agile principles and minimizing the amount of work not done. That's my favorite Agile principle. How might we use that principle in relation to the daily Scrum? And I would just start to brainstorm on that. Like, what are some of the things that I could do that would maximize that? And one thing that I had come up with is, all right, the board needs to be updated before you walk into daily Scrum. So we're not wasting time having somebody update the board before you even get started on your talk. And then I explain, that's why we want to do it, is because we're going to maximize the amount of work not done in this event, in this 15-minute time block, when we're supposed to be talking about the plans for the day. We're not updating from yesterday. And so this is just a small example of how I've used it and how I've shared it with people. Now, that's not something I went and that's not a document all these things. It's a go do it. Just go do it kind of thing.
When you do this, when you're not inside the company, when you're actually doing this in the real world, do you not follow the same process? Do you still follow the same process in your head? How does that actually help happen?
I would say the how might we question bubbles up a lot. And as soon as that question bubbles up, I write it down. I will write it down, because it's like, okay, this is a trigger. And by the way, everything has become an experiment, because once you do one experiment, everything becomes an experiment. And then that experiment leads to another experiment. And sometimes they're like, let's try this thing. Let's see what happens. And then sometimes it'll raise its head when I have an assumption about something. If I say, well, I think this, and then somebody will question me on it, it's a note to myself to say, okay, I need to write that down, and I want to write experiment around that. And I'll actually, so I would say if there's an assumption out there that somebody challenges or I recognize it myself, I will actually write out an experiment. And if it's a how might we, I might just go do it. Okay. Just, how might I keep the deer from eating my flowers? I can go buy whatever outside and spray it on there, or I can go ask a nursery person. I've used the popcorn flow before, but that's, to set up the experiments. Right. That felt like a lot of overhead, but like I said, sometimes it's just how might I do this thing? And then what did I learn out of that? Oh, that's what it is. But then that usually kicks off another experiment, which will then lead to something that I actually write out.
Tammy, this has been fantastic. If you woke up tomorrow morning, somebody gave you your daily beverage of choice when you're getting up in the morning, coffee, caffeine, whatever it is, and a magic wand, and said you had the power to change any two things affecting how work is delivered, what would those two things be and why?
How might we get leaders to understand that Scrum does not necessarily mean faster, or Agile doesn't mean faster? That would be one thing, is that I would change leadership's viewpoint, mindset, Agile mindset around what it means to be an Agile team or what it means to be a Scrum team. And I would create psychological safety for everyone.
Why doesn't that happen? That one I directly relate to, and I'm still convinced that maybe that's impossible in a corporate environment.
It's very near impossible, I think. But I won't say that anything is impossible. For me, there's hierarchy in corporations, and it means something right now. Those titles, those people, those things matter to people, and they don't feel empowered. And you don't empower people, but the system that they're in is not empowering. They want to be told what to do so that they have the right answers and that they have a paycheck tomorrow.
Understood. Tammy, how can people continue the conversation? How can they reach out?
Right now, they can reach out to me on LinkedIn. And something that I've been working on, I didn't announce it earlier, but I am working on a kind of a cohort similar to my experience with Nike around Agile. And that will be at TammyGretz, alloneword.com. You'll be able to see that in the next couple of weeks or so.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll slowly put out the podcast so that it catches up. As I said, this is marvelous. I'm really glad that I didn't succumb to Zoom fatigue and actually sat in on and listened to the Women in Agile up in Cleveland. This was it's just a wonderful discovery. There's a book coming, of course.
I hope. I wish. That's always on my list. Maybe I should write a book.
This sounds like a great topic for a book.
A little book of big experiments.
There you go. I think that sounds like a heck of a title. Tammy, this has been fantastic. As you may or may not know, I open up the platform here at the end as we're rolling away, and I provide it, for you to promote anything that you'd like. Now, the podcast has been up for about 15 years now. Even show 0 is still up on Apple iTunes and in other places. So selling your car on eBay, probably not the right use of this real estate. But the platform's yours.
Yeah. No, as I said, I'm really looking forward to building out this program that we are working on for Scrum Masters to get experiment experience, to use those words. Because somebody said to me, well, why don't you actually make that your job, Tammy? Why don't you help people run experiments in an Agile way and using the Agile principles? And it's what you're doing for your job. Why don't you do it outside? Why don't you try to do it? And how might I? It popped up in the back of my head. And so we started a project, and that's where it's at. So like I said, TammyGretz.com.
Super.
Coming at you soon.
And when it's up and running, we'll come back, and I'd like to explore that with you and shine a little light on it from the point of view of the listenership of the Software Process and Measurement Cast. Tammy, thank you very much for spending time on a Friday afternoon in Ohio.
Thank you very much for having me. This has been great.
Remember, the Software Process and Measurement Cast is the proud media sponsor of the first Global Scrum Master Summit. The week of May 17th, it'll be online, both a combination of live and recorded. Links in the show notes to get a ticket. In Reread Saturday News, Chapter 12. By the way, we are about 4 weeks out from the end of this reread, and I'm starting to consider what should go next. If you have an idea, let me know. But Chapter 12, in Fixing Your Scrum, Practical Solutions to Common Scrum Problems by Ryan Ripley and Todd Miller, talks about the daily Scrum. The daily meeting might be a ubiquitous feature of corporate life, but it can be better. If you haven't bought your copy, use the link in the show notes, support the podcast, and most importantly, support the authors. Links to this week's installment of the reread and previous weeks are all in the show notes at www.spamcast.net and many other places. In the next Software Process and Measurement Cast, we'll chew on work entry patterns. There are 5 basic patterns. Which are you? Why is one better than another? And remember, some are downright not useful for Agile. We'll also have a visit from Tony Timble bringing the story on user stories to the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?